So, while progress, or whatever we can call it, has been made in the EU when it comes towards LGBTI equality over the past years, at the same time, we witness that discrimination against LGBTI people continues across the EU. So according to figures based on an EU-wide survey presented in the Equality Strategy for 2020 to 2025, no less than 43% of the respondents said that they continue to feel discriminated. When it comes to discrimination at work, 19% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, 35% of trans people, and 32% of intersex people felt discriminated against at work. When it comes to hate-motivated harassment for being LGBTI, 38% of respondents said that they had faced this harassment in the 12 months preceding the survey. And finally, 40% of respondents pointed to ethnic origin or immigrant background as an additional ground for discrimination besides being LGBTI. So given that LGBTI people's everyday experience varies significantly across the EU, can we actually speak of a union of equality? Also, although social acceptance of LGBTI people had risen from 71% in 2015 to 76% in 2019, it had actually gone down in no less than 9 member states. Then there's also a trend in parts of the EU of more frequent anti-LGBTI incidents, such as attacks on LGBTI public events, including prides. And marches, and also so-called declarations of LGBTI ideology-free zones and homophobic intimidation at carnival festivities. In turn, civil society organizations protecting and advancing the rights of LGBTI people increasingly report that they face hostility. All of this coincides with the rise of the anti-gender and anti-LGBTI movements. There's also the question of often overlooked groups of LGBTI people, such as sex workers and queer refugees, who face specific struggles that are barely addressed. Now, the state of play brings me to a first question for our speakers, and I would like to ask this question to Belinda. So, if you could put it briefly, which might be a challenge, how would you describe the current state of LGBTI equality within the EU?
On already? Yeah, it's good. Okay, so maybe I can just quickly explain what ILGA Europe is for those who don't know. We're a European level LGBTI NGO, and we're membership based. We have over 700 member organizations in Europe and Central Asia. And they're big ones such as Stonewall or RFSL, but then down to grassroots small organizations. And something that we do every year is we compile what's called our annual review, which is it's information from our membership about the reality on the ground in a number of different categories. And we've been doing that for approximately 12 years. And so the one that was published this year showed the highest rates in terms of, not in terms of numbers data, but in terms of the anecdotal information being provided, the highest rates of violence against LGBTI people since we started reporting. So what I can say is that the situation at the moment is it's quite polarized in Europe. There's a lot of hate crime, and as Fabienne mentioned, often actually around prides or public visibility events. And a lot of hate speech, which has obviously got a lot worse during the pandemic, and that's kind of remained quite high, especially against LGBTI human rights defenders. We're also seeing the kind of a more anti-LGBTI hate marches, let's say. I would say last year, before Serbia's Europride, that kind of created a little bit of a trend in that region, but also in other places. There's still key legislation that's lacking in the EU related to, for example, hate crime and hate speech, anti-discrimination, based on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. So those protections are still quite limited in a number of countries. But also we're seeing, thankfully this year, after a few years of significant stagnation in a lot of EU countries, we're seeing movement in the legislative field forward on banning, for example, conversion therapies, or introducing updated legal gender recognition procedures and protections for intersex people and trans people more broadly. So that's kind of picking up a bit in a number of EU member states. And I would say there's also, it's a very mixed picture where we've had previously quite a lot of hatred. There's also more creative and perhaps more community-based strategies coming from activists, which has led to an increase in social acceptance in some places, especially, for example, if you look at Poland, the proliferation of prides since prides were attacked quite a bit in 2019, 2020. Now there's more prides, I think, than in any other country in the EU. And we have heard very recently that this is actually really translating into acceptance on the ground, as you have prides in tiny villages, for example. But yeah, just overall, I would say that there's big polarization in the political field. There's utilization of LGBTI rights by politicians to gain power, and that enables a vocal minority of anti-LGBTI people. And I need to look at Fabienne for time if I should keep going, or or am I okay?
No, I think you really have given quite a good overview. I would like to pass to Kun now for my next question, namely whether we can actually speak of a union of equality in this field, or is it really rather an utopia, given that we still have very strong divergences between the member states?
Thanks, Fabian. I feel like I'm going to do my usual role of being the forever skepticist. But I think my short answer would be no. I don't think we can speak of union of equality. But I also think what I have noticed, there's a shift in how the EU has has been speaking about LGBT equality in the last 15 years or so, where in the beginning was very much, this is part of our values. We are standing for LGBT equality in the way it was promoting itself towards candidate countries and international arena. It was very much, we are there already. And my colleague Laura Agerman, she always reminds me of how the discourse of the EU has really changed since that now with the von der Leyen Commission is much more an aspirational model of we are trying to achieve an idea that is more equal. And so it is that kind of utopian aspirational kind of value. But whilst the discourse has shifted, to me, I see there's a massive lack of action on the EU bodies, which comes from a variety of reasons, which I'm sure we'll pick up on later. But I'm thinking especially about how LGBT people have become instrumentalized in far-right politics, in general politics, in many different member states, the latest being Italy, and yet we see no comments from the European bodies. Maybe the parliament is the most vocal and the most political on these issues, but we don't never really see anything changing. And one of these is obviously lack of competences within the EU, but I also feel, or not enough legislation. But I think it was very unlikely to change given the nature of the polarization within the union. The member states are more so than ever divided on LGBT issues, and sadly those are the issues that require unanimity in the council. So it's almost impossible to achieve this dream that von der Leyen is trying to present due to the governmental structures of the European Union. So in my mind, I just can't see it ever establishing itself as a union of equality. That would be, I'm trying to keep it short for time.
No, thank you. But then if we move on to a related question, so apparently there has been also a decrease in the social acceptance of LGBTI people in EU member states, although it also there diverges from member state to member state. Then how could we explain that? And for that, I'm turning to Tunay.
Yes. Hi, everyone. So answering this question first, maybe I should explain my approach. So I work as a researcher, as you mentioned, at Humboldt University of Berlin. I conduct research with groups, mostly queer migrants and refugees based in Germany. And I use qualitative approaches, meaning that I care about people's stories and kind of like individual experience of border crossing. So this is where I'm coming from. Answering this question, the reason of decrease in social acceptance of LGBTQ people, I have 3 points that I want to kind of like add to our discussion. So probably we can all think of like reasons like COVID-19 pandemic, cost of living crisis, war in Ukraine, political and social instability, housing crisis, as possible elements that kind of create or increase the level of stress over marginalized and underrepresented groups. But I think we should carry this discussion to something else. First of all, the increase of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric is not an isolated issue. Actually, in Germany, federal office just announced that in 2022, racially motivated crimes increased by 14% compared to the previous year. So actually, anti-LGBTQ discourse is increasing, and the crimes are increasing at the same time. Racial motivated crimes are also increasing. So we have to ask the question of how we can put this into dialogue together, how we can try to understand why some communities or people or groups are struggling with the idea of living in difference. The second thing is that I want to mention, I'm interested to also hear your opinions on that, is the issue of like social acceptance, the decrease in social acceptance coexists with homonormativity. Because obviously when we're talking about LGBTQ issue or LGBTQ experiences, we are talking about a very diverse group of people, right? We are talking about lesbians, gays, bisexual, trans people, intersex people, migrants, refugees. So one good example, and please let me know if I'm crossing my time limit, but so recently we heard from AfD's Alice Weidel. This is the far-right political party in Germany, AfD. She's a lesbian who's married to a woman, but she recently made a public statement stating that she is a lesbian, but she's not queer. So she wanted to distance herself from the movement, and we call it like a bungee jumping, and kind of situate herself in the German media and the German mainstream as an acceptable lesbian person. So what is the distinction between being queer and being a lesbian? And I think this is a very important issue that we also have to address. And here I'm thinking about Aaron Azura's work, who's a trans studies scholar who conducted research about trans citizens in Australia. And Azura showed that trans people, in order to be accepted in Australia, they not only have to conform to a binary understanding of gender, but they also have to perform a certain notions of nationalism. So I think this is a very interesting moment for the LGBTQ movement, where we see homonormativity coexisting with homophobia and transphobia. So this is just a way to complicate the discussion. And the third and final point, and I'll be very brief, is the experiences and the public perception of increasing homophobia and transphobia is being utilized by far-right groups. So this is a very important point that we have to be also very aware of, because again, the same politician that I just mentioned from AfD, Alice Weidel, she basically said that in order to tackle homophobia in Germany, they have to address Muslim gangs and migrants. So they are using actually the increasing numbers of homophobia and transphobia in order to promote anti-migrant and anti-refugee politics. So this is, again, a very tricky and important, I think, intersection that we have to be aware of. So yeah, these are the 3 interventions that I want to make with this question.
Okay, thank you. Gung, you would like to follow up on this?
Yeah, thank you, Tunay, for bringing this up, because it's very aligned with things I was thinking about this question. And I think I mean, one of my things is I'm always perplexed of why we are so surprised of the return of homophobia. Like, so many people have been telling, but we've made such a progress, we've moved so on forwards, we've seen this shift in opinion polls. But I mean, maybe it's my forever skepticism, but I never believed it. And I think there is this, it's always been a very conditional tolerance that has been adopted within how we are talking about LGBT issues, which has been very normalized. It's been very, also the discourse of activism has shifted within neoliberalism to be about love is love, and all of the edgy queer things that challenges the heteronormative system have all been erased from the movement in many places, or at least the mainstream movement. There's still a lot of critical movement existing, but the mainstream narrative has been very much pushed to this love is love narrative, which the EU is also pushing for. It's the only way it fits within its model. But I think that what it really does, it is creating a conditionality on how we are being accepted. We accept it when we create a family, we get married, we get a family, but we remain actually quite invisible and don't create a challenge to the system. Actually, we must remain invisible in our difference. And I think that's the kind of point you're making. And to me, I think the way in which homophobia then is expressed and is being questioned within social attitude surveys is no longer looking at the right aspect, because it's no longer just about, are we against gays? That's not the question anymore. Are we against those who are challenging the system vis-a-vis are those who are reproducing the system that we are benefiting from so much? And so that would be my first point, is we can't trust the social statistics because we are no longer asking the right questions. And that's the job for us as academics, I think, to kind of think about how do we change these questions. But also then I think it's that turn of the right, and where we're getting in this double bind where we are this political tool that is used in any way possible for any political goal that's benefiting left, right, center, and the people on the street are actually no longer cared for. And that's, I really thank you, Tunay, for making that plea. And what I just see as well is the politicization, not just for anti-racial or anti-migrant dynamics, but also anti-EU dynamics, anti-establishment dynamics. We are just the main political tool, and I don't know how to say others. But I think what we're losing there is the human aspect, and we're forgetting the damage that's been done to individual people on the street every single day. And so in this question of like, I mean, and I do it all the time. I'm a sociologist originally a long time ago. I aspire still to be one, although academia will no longer say I am one. But in my work, I keep reminding myself I have to go back to look at the people, because if you don't look at the people, then what are we talking about? Because we can talk about abstract concepts of a union of equality, but if people are being hurt exponentially more years on years on years, then what's the point? So I just want to really emphasize what you said tonight, because I appreciate you bringing it up.
Okay, thanks for raising these points. And I think one of the questions that is emerging, but I think this also relates to your earlier research, is whether we should problematize the whole notion of progress. And that brings me to the next question, which I would like to ask, first of all, to Laura. And that concerns the rise of the anti-gender, but also the anti-LGBTI movements. So this is something which I think we have been witnessing in the past few years, maybe decades already. And then the question is also whether the EU should try to counter this. But then the question is also, who is the EU? If it's the member states, then but if it's the Commission with its Union of Equality, then yeah, how should they position themselves towards this? Or should they not position themselves at all?
Thanks, Fabienne, for this question. I think some of the points I'll make will follow up or echo some of the discussions we've already heard. I think, first of all, it's an important question to raise. And, you know, when you ask, should the EU position itself against these movements, I think we already see from the text of the strategy itself that it is very much depoliticized. So I think it really overlooks all this context that we've been talking about. So the rise of the far right within the EU, the democratic backsliding and the way in which it affects the rights of LGBTI people and women, and also internationally speaking, the whole authoritarian realignment that we are seeing. So I also think it's important when we speak about anti-gender movement, as Tunai already alluded to have an intersectional understanding of what they are and how they come about and what they do. Because again, there is resistance vis-a-vis LGBTI rights, but it is not the only target. So we also have to understand how these anti-gender movements within the EU are very much interlinked with certain ethno-nationalist projects that attempt to also exclude racialized minorities and communities from a specific idea of what a nation is. And I also think a second important element there, and this we see more specifically, I think, in the eastern part of Europe and beyond, that very often these anti-gender movements are framed in anti-colonial or anti-imperialist terms, and directed vis-a-vis the West, or the EU as sort of part of it. And this is also linked with a certain contestation of neoliberalism and neoliberal politics that we see very much in the eastern part of Europe, because this was sort of, in a way, the tale or the promise that was sold to these countries when socialism collapsed, that they would eventually catch up with the West and certain standards of living, which didn't materialize really. And these inequalities still persist, which are very much symbolic but also material between East and West. And so basically, very often for local nationalists, LGBTI people, queer people, are a scapegoat for this kind of social anxieties and become a proxy in a way to voice these grievances that are maybe anti-Western or anti-imperialist in nature. So against this backdrop, if we start from this point, I think then more liberal rights or more neoliberal policy is definitely not the remedy. It's actually part of the problem. And then I don't know if I have time for one last very short point. I think very often when we speak about anti-gender movements in this part of Europe, we tend to essentialize or to reduce them as something that comes from the East, like the illiberal part of the EU, or that is even sometimes I hear exported from some external powers, like Russia is always pointed to. And I mean, I'm not denying that, of course, there are these influences and they are not positive, of course. But we also do not have, we don't have to lose sight of the whole set of ideological and financial connections that anti-gender groups have both in the West and in the East. And I think sometimes it's easy to externalize the problem, but we shouldn't do it.
Okay, well, Laura, I would like to stay with you. So now we've looked into the state of play of LGBTI equality in the EU. So this brings me to a second set of questions, which I think we've already touched upon to some extent. So what the EU can and should do or not do to improve LGBTIQ equality in the EU. And first of all, there's a question of legitimacy. So does the EU have the legitimacy to strive for a union of equality in the field of LGBTQI equality?
Yeah, so again, I think we've already partly started answering this question. And I think for me, the question of legitimacy is also linked to this discourse that Koen was talking about, the way in which the EU has, for the past 10 or 15 years, maybe framed its own identity around this idea of protection of human rights and LGBTI rights, even though, okay, it has changed in a way. But I think we have to talk about maybe the more problematic side of this kind of conflating of EU Europeanness and LGBT friendliness, because again, as we started talking about already, this is very much also linked with exclusionary practices that are also racialized in nature. And so, how does the idea of a union of equality actually fit with the fact that LGBTI, the pro-LGBTI discourse is instrumentalized by far-right or conservative groups within the EU to scapegoat Muslim communities or to restrict immigration, to advocate for more strongly regulated borders. And I think actually reading the strategy again, there's very disturbing passages even there when there's a mention of, the EU will foster certain exchange of good practices among member states in relation to protection standards that apply to LGBTI asylum seekers, in relation to their detention when applicable. I mean, to me, this sounds like very disturbing. So I think, again, it is important not to see the field of LGBTI equality in isolation from other fields, policy fields, and what the EU is doing in other policy fields. So again, how does the Union of Equality fit with the externalization of migration, the constant narrative of crisis, or even this very masculinized, I would say, posture that the EU has been adopting over the past couple of years on the external, on the global stage. So I think it's, legitimacy is not just about, different legislative standards in member states or coherence, or can the EU speak with a single voice, which it cannot, as we already discussed, but really also about this kind of the dark side, let's say, of this Union of Equality that also allows its sort of reproduction. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. Then I would like to turn to Koen for my next question, which I think you have already partly answered in our previous round of questions. And that's a question whether the EU is actually capable of significantly advancing LGBTI equality, and thus whether it's actually capable of striving for a Union of Equality. You already mentioned that, the discourse is quite aspirational, and so they are just seeing it as a sort of utopia, but at least they want to go for that dream. But what about the reality? Like, are they really capable of significantly advancing LGBTI equality?
I would say no, but I will qualify why I say no, because but I think the first point I always think about when you think about is the EU capable, I always think of the horizontal anti-discrimination directive, which was proposed, I think, in 2008. You're the expert, so which has been stuck for 15 years in the council with no progress. And even though initially it was not moving forward, not because of LGBT issues, but more because certain member states thought it would be too expensive to have to adjust all of their government buildings to make them accessible for disabled people, or people with disabilities, I should say. Now it's become stuck within the council, I guess, especially for LGBTI reasons as well. And because these kind of policies require unanimity within the council, given the polarization I think we have already established that currently exists, I don't see any political future for this directive to go anywhere. And so even on the legislative grounds, there is no room for maneuvering on LGBT issues, given that it's already been so polarized and so instrumentalized as a proxy battleground for other issues that are at play. But then also I think, and this to me seems very typical to the EU, is that it's always acting, I would say, about 10 years too late for everything. It's already reactionary, and it should have acted on many issues when the first instances of problems are arising and nip them in the bud rather than waiting 10 years to go there. And here I think the most glaring example is the current court case against Hungary for the infringement procedure, which for the first time ever has been invoking the treaty values of Article 2, especially mentioning LGBTI issues and the whole the law on protecting the child, or whatever it's called in Hungary, which started all about Netflix show wasn't allowed to be shown in Hungary because it wasn't appropriately age labeled, which is against single market rules. So the commission started infringement procedure. But in this procedure, and this is where I'm really scared, is it's linking equality to the single market. And if the commission wins this court case, all accounts, then great, we have made progress. I'm not a lawyer, but my sense is that this is never going to be the case, because the competences of the EU are such that actually a lot of these issues that are being put forward as breaches of Article 2, I don't think the court will be an activist court in actually making this argument. And what I see as a far more likely outcome is that the court will reaffirm a hierarchy of EU principles with single market first, human rights, and the articles, the values that are enshrined in Article 2 will be secondary to the economic nature of the EU. And I think we need to be really scared, because the moment that happens, any possibility of movement I see becoming very problematic. That being said, there are also instances where we are using the ECJ or the Court for Justice to get stuff going. And I think when it comes to same-sex families, where the EU has no competence whatsoever, we have managed to use the single market and the freedom of movement as a backdoor stop to have the ECJ make rulings in favor of recognition of same-sex families across borders. And so there is some scope for improvement, but I think it's a route we have to be very careful. And I think because the Commission has been so late with Hungary, I think we have made it more problematic than if it was done 10 years ago. So it's a very pessimistic. Sorry, I was writing these notes when I was on the train, and I thought, damn, this is very pessimistic. But I think, yeah, anyway, I'll leave it there.
Okay, well then maybe it's my job to make sure that we can still see some optimism. Because, well, another question I have is then, what are the main strengths of the EU's approach? I mean, we have already seen, I think, a lot of insight into its weaknesses, so let's not cover that now. But what are the strengths then of the EU's approach? Tunay, would you be able to address that question?
I have one also about weaknesses. No, but I mean, I can also talk about strengths. So the report mentions intersectionality. So I think it is a very good starter to understand how we can maybe approach intersectionality in practice, which is a very challenging task to do. Also in research, also in activism, community organizing, how can we really stay true to intersectionality, how can we really pay respect and understanding to different experiences. So I think this is good that report did that. In addition to intersectionality, we have 830,000 citizens living in Berlin, 830,000 people. So it's a very big number. I think if we are talking about human equality and LGBTQ rights in Europe, we have to think about the perspectives of non-citizens. This includes migrants, refugees, people who are in Europe with different statuses, undocumented migrants. So I think this number is not something that could be like maybe brushed aside. So when we are thinking about intersectionality, we have to keep this in mind. How can we understand the experience of non-citizens, LGBTQ people? Most often, again, based on my research in Berlin, when I talk to LGBTQ migrants, it is very difficult for them to distinguish the motivation behind discriminative acts. They don't necessarily go and ask an aggressor, hey, did you treat me bad because I'm trans or because I'm a migrant? So it's just a bad treatment, right? So most often the experience of racism of LGBTQ migrants are motivated by homophobia and transphobia. And it is difficult to actually distinguish the two. So when we are talking about intersectionality, I think the report could do a better job at talking about these intersecting experiences. Other good things. Yeah, I think I'm really happy that the report addressed issues of homelessness. So I think it's a very important issue when we are talking about LGBTQ lives. Again, it is connected to intersectionality. I worked with trans sex workers in Berlin in 2018. And there, the experience of transness is very much connected to people who are doing a very much marginalized work in society. And dealing with drug addiction, mental health issues, homelessness, and they are all interconnected to being trans or being queer. So in that case, I think this point about homelessness could even be expanded. So this is another positive side I see.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I would like to stay with you actually for my next question, because what we also wanted to do with our panel discussion was to really look into what this union of equality and then the strategy, what it means in practice really for the respective communities and people. My question would then be also to you, Tunay. So how have people from the LGBTI communities responded to the strategy? So do they feel that the EU accounts for their struggles and concerns, between brackets, sufficiently accounts for their struggles and concerns?
I could answer this question from two perspectives, because I'm from Turkey, a candidate country with some involvement to EU politics, and also from Germany. One issue that I want to mention from Laura's point about anti-gender and anti-LGBTQ movements using the discourse of anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. So in the case of Turkey, for example, it was Euroscepticism. So whenever we are seeing reports or EU groups supporting grassroots organizations or activist groups, the state was easily weaponizing Euroscepticism in order to demonize those very important activist figures and public figures. So it shows something. I mean, I guess the report mentions tailor-made strategies. I think it's a very important issue. And the question of how we can really prepare tailor-made strategies is, I think, one of the biggest challenges. I guess it involves really working with people, as you mentioned, and Ilga, like working with people, really like with grounded methods, talking to activists and understanding what would be the right strategies. So it wouldn't necessarily feed into this Eurosceptic or anti-imperialist discourses that some of the far-right and right-wing politicians love to use. So that's one issue. But having said that, still, I think the EU politics really, from the aspirational side, play a big role for people who are doing LGBT activism in EU states and non-EU states. So, yeah.
Well, I would like to also ask the same question to Belinda. Would you second what Tunay has just said?
Yeah, definitely with the tailor-made strategies. That's something that we do a lot of work on with our membership. And just, I guess I can link that a little bit with what you said earlier about this queer ideology being used by a right-wing lesbian in Germany. It's, you know, the anti-gender movement has been existing for a long time, has a very long-term vision. They have, you know, strategy documents that span like 20 years into the future. They have their own utopia that they're working towards, and they enter each national or even local context via different willing actors. That can be a government, that can be you know, a church, that can be people who are transphobic within the LGBTI community. So it's really, you know, a broad mix, and so it's really important to recognize that this is across the whole continent. It's not one form of Eastern liberalism. It's a well-connected, not only across Western and Eastern Europe, but the whole world movement. And they are very sneaky. They just knock on many doors and wait until one opens, and then they adapt their strategy according to which door that was. And so with the sorry, back on the strategy, the LGBTI strategy of the EU, and what it means for communities. I mean, obviously I work more with the movement, so those are the activists serving the communities. But what they have reported to us is that it's, and the way we view it actually, is that it's more of a symbolic document. And I think that links with what Koen was saying earlier about kind of the EU's own utopia, or at least those who drafted this document. And that's important. I think it's an important first step. I think a lot of people felt seen by the strategy, that the EU cares. But then, of course, you know, what that actually means in practice is another thing. It very much depends on the country. It's not a legally binding document. So if you have a member state that doesn't want to do any of the recommendations or to even read the document, then there's not much happening. But it is helpful to some extent when it comes to, the exchange of best practices. It would be great if they did that more regularly and if they did that among member states in a more thorough way. Some of the exchanges of best practices, for example, on trans and intersex inclusion in the labor market, DG Employment wasn't even there, and they were meant to be leading it. So I think that then on this strategy, maybe, well, there will be a second one, but I think the political statement has kind of been made. There's been legislation and policies outlined that are quite good. But then really it goes into the question of how can the EU make something happen? And quite a lot of the issue is on the level of how it works, even not only with the council problem and the legislative competence of the EU, but actually also within the kind of nitty-gritty daily work of the European Commission. We've seen quite big changes on when it comes to funding and the anti-LGBT resolutions, also known as LGBT-free zones in Poland, that were done because of the individual officers within the DG Regio specifically, who just took the cause to their heart and worked really hard on it and made actually quite a big difference, a tangible difference on the ground. So we need to see kind of the Commission, I think, reflecting more on how it works on not only LGBTI issues, but equality issues in general, how to bring more DGs into that idea of mainstreaming, because there are different, things given, let's say, in the strategy to different DGs, and we've been knocking on their doors for a long time, and we're quite well established in the EU sphere, and some of these DGs just don't want to speak at all, and they leave it only to DG Just. So it's something that we're calling for. It's more structured kind of coordination within the Commission, having someone working permanently on LGBTI within DG Just, and then also really having DG Just working more properly with the other DGs on implementation. So I went completely out of my speaking notes there. Just going to check to see if there's anything else that I would want to share on this. Let's see. Yeah, no, I think that this is most of it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we've arrived at the final set of questions for this discussion before we open up the floor for questions from the audience. Now, one of the 4 pillars of the strategy, namely the final pillar, is centered on advancing LGBTQI equality around the world. So then the question is, okay, what does this then mean for LGBTI people outside the EU? And so first question I would like to ask here, well, given the various difficulties that the Commission is faced with in advancing LGBTI equality inside the EU, does it then actually make sense for the EU to also focus on advancing LGBTI equality outside of the EU? So how much of a priority should this then be for the Commission? And so for this, I would like to first give the floor to Laura.
Thank you. I think in partly, I mean, I would answer this question by referring to similar caveats that I already mentioned earlier. So whenever I read, the EU's aspiration to lead the call for LGBTIQ equality in the world, I'm constantly wondering, or I'm constantly rather thinking that we have to also be careful about the, potential backfiring effects of the EU taking up this kind of mission to the rest of the world. But of course, I mean, I think maybe I echoing a point that Belinda also make, I think in general, there is, when the EU presents itself as a promoter of LGBTIQ rights in the world, people, communities, activists outside the EU do feel seen and do feel that solidarity can, that they are very much in need of solidarity, and that somehow the EU can provide this form of solidarity. But I think we always have to question, how can the EU practice transnational solidarity in a context of asymmetrical power relations, and also in a context where these communities that the EU wants to reach out on the ground and support face political homophobia, or a context where anti-gender movements and violence are very active. So, I think, again, it has to be tailor-made, as we mentioned. It has to be context specific, because there is also a risk of putting already vulnerable LGBTIQ communities under further pressure and vulnerability if there is too much emphasis, for instance, on LGBTIQ rights over other rights or other struggle, other claims for justice that are seen as important by local communities. Also, if the EU is too vocally condemning, it can be accused of, again, neocolonialism, and this can always generate further backlash for the communities on the ground, while again reinforcing this hierarchy where the EU is kind of the savior, and maybe but again, this has to be very context specific, and it's difficult to give an answer, broadly speaking. But I think these are all like caveats that we have to bear in mind. And another thing maybe that I want to mention is, again, when we think about this recent so-called geopolitical turn of the European Union on the global stage, this idea, I think, as far as my sense is, when I'm talking with EU officials, that this means for them that they have to be more strong, more coherent, more decisive in promoting the EU values, or whatever the European way of life is abroad. And I think this leaves very little space, honestly, for self-reflection, for listening, actually, rather than having to always do more. Maybe listening could also be a good strategy. But again, in this context where the EU is trying to promote itself as a more geopolitical actor and more assertive one, I think, there's not a lot of space for that.
Okay, thank you. I don't know, Junai, if you wanted to add anything to this question.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great answer, Laura. So maybe I can mention one thing. 2 years ago, we organized a conference called Queer Feminist Critics of Political Homophobia and Anti-Feminism in Europe and the Middle East. It was a conference organized by Humboldt University and Brown University. So there we discussed ways to understand like LGBTQ rights and ways to maybe regionalize Europe and de-exceptionalize the Middle East when we're talking about LGBTQ rights. And if we are talking about non-EU or like a global impact of EU politics, I guess one issue would be promoting regional understandings of queerness and LGBTQ identity without prioritizing or privileging European way of being LGBTQ. And it is a very difficult task, as we see with the queer asylum cases in Europe. So there is this tendency of understanding a one-dimensional way of being queer. So if this is going to be the case, of course, then there will be backfiring effect, backlashes, and at the same time, possible problems with the work done at the regional level. So that's, I guess, my addition to that. But at the same time, I think it's inevitable, because I think whatever EU decides to do, obviously this conversation will go, because as I said, there are migrants, there are people watching, there are people following what's happening. So the ideas will for sure migrate, travel, which is good. So maybe then this critical perspective is necessary no matter what. Okay, then for the very final part of our discussion here, I would like to focus on the EU candidate countries. As most of you probably know, European Council President Charles Michel recently announced the ambition to enable the next round of EU enlargement within 10 years. So hence my question, but how is the state of LGBTI equality currently in the EU candidate countries? Of course, we have quite diverse group of countries there, but still I think it's worth highlighting this also in light of the ambition, well, maybe not shared by the entire EU, but at least by Charles Michel, to enable the next round of EU enlargement within 10 years. And for this, I would like to turn first of all to Belinda.
I always find this interesting now. So I work on enlargement, actually working with that process within ILGA Europe, and I have other portfolios that I work on, but this is one I work quite a lot on. So obviously, I would say that the situation in Turkey and Ukraine is probably like ostensibly the worst when it comes for LGBTI rights when I'm looking at legislation and so on. Well, legislation, I would say, mostly. And but in the Western Balkans, so the 6 Western Balkan countries that have been in this process now for a very long time, there actually are quite good legal frameworks, you know, especially on anti-discrimination, hate crime, and hate speech. Actually, civil society space is relatively okay as well. So there are some places in the EU, there are some countries in the EU that really don't have as much legal protection on paper. But the age-old problematic with this region, and I'm sure with many other areas, is you know, implementation is really lacking. You know, societal attitudes cannot be measured by legislation, especially when the legislation was adopted because the governments felt that this is what the EU wanted and this is what they needed to do to join the EU. So that's kind of yeah, that's broadly speaking the problematic there. And I'm, you know, now starting to work a bit more on Moldova and Georgia. Also, the legislation is you know, when it comes to hate crime, hate speech, not bad for LGBT people. But yeah, then we have this issue, as we've been seeing, at the geopolitics. You have still got countries trying to please the EU, but you also do have some leaders in some of the accession region, that are also trying to play to Russia, or at least pro-Russian segments of their population. And so now LGBTI topics or rights has become really a geopolitical like tool and issue in that region. It was really obvious at Belgrade Pride. It's obvious at Tbilisi Pride, and it's obvious in other moments as well. And so that is a kind of strange two-faced issue that some governments have at the moment in trying to please both the EU and the Russian parts of population, or pro-Russian parts of population. And this is playing out, I would say, mostly when it comes to the concept of family. That seems to be one of the, you know, one of the doors, one of the conduits that I mentioned earlier for the anti-gender movement. That seems to be really the main thing at the moment, and that's not only in the accession region, but really picking up also in the EU as well. We just need to look at Italy. So family legislation is almost entirely lacking in accession countries. What I would say, yeah, I think public opinion, it really does vary. I'm really interested in Turkey. I'm sure Tune will be able to say more. But what I found really interesting hearing from Turkish activists is that, okay, so now we've had an election that went badly for them, but actually they estimate around 50% of the population are really very tired of the anti-LGBTI instrumentalization. It's very, very clear, and a lot of people are beginning to stand up in support of LGBTI people. And there has been kind of around the topic of LGBTI, there's been a kind of solidarity within the general civic space, so civil society organizations and people who are standing up for democracy, and how that impacts actually on the daily lived realities of LGBTI people in Turkey. It's not as bad as it looks, basically, is what the message that they're trying to say is. It's not as bad as we think it is on the daily reality. But of course, if the government then comes in and starts to shut down organizations, or starts to, you know, really act on these labels of so-called terrorism, then that will become a tangible reality that is much more severe. Yeah, and I find Ukraine also very interesting. We have, you know, quite bad legal framework, almost non-existent for LGBTI people, and actually we cannot forget that there is quite a strong far-right anti-LGBTI movement within Ukrainian society, but here we have a country that really wants to join the EU. So there's a lot of opportunity for passing legislation, and then we can go into a whole discussion about like the problematics around that. But if it's implemented, then it can be something that really makes a difference to people. So yeah, it's an interesting area at the moment. And yeah, I think it needs to be approached by the EU very carefully. And again, going back to that, what I was saying about how does the EU do its work, and well, yeah, I could have a whole discussion about how the EU.
That's actually my very final question. What can and should the EU do then, or should it not do anything? Which might also be a possible question. For that, I would like to give the floor first to Koen.
I want to start. Well, thanks, Belinda, for saying all the things I want to say. I mean, we talk a lot, so I know that we're kind of aligned. I think what the EU should do, I mean, all right. Well, first, let me establish first that laws and institutions are important, and that's also where the EU can have the most impact. That's the very conditionality is the only time it actually works, or when it attaches money to establishing large institutions or providing financial support. That's the only time we see change occur. At least I mostly study the Western Balkans, so I'm speaking from that experience. That caveat being said, I do think the way the EU is currently engaging with LGBT issues, or actually any of the fundamental rights issue, it's too focused on whether the outcome has been achieved. Is that law been adopted? Has the bride happened? And doesn't actually look into the process by which that has been made possible. Because often when you start looking at how it has been made possible, you start seeing that it's riddled with homophobia, and that actually the discourses underneath by the people adopting the laws, by the people allowing for pride to happen. And I'm thinking in particular the debacle of 2022 Europe Pride in Belgrade, where ironically again a lesbian prime minister said a lot of very her and the president with a lot of very subtle homophobic issues whilst they're allowing pride to happen, and yet nobody has actually picked up on the discourse that Alexander Vučić has been declaring since, and it's only gone actually worse. And there's no kind of condemnation of the politics being done. And also, I think, well, there seems to be a lack of willingness to see how candidate countries are using LGBT issues to score points with the EU. And I think, and that comes to this process, right? Is that I always say, like, why has the change been made? We shouldn't just be happy that the change has been made. We should ask why. Because if the reason for making change is wrong, we will guaranteed know that there will be no implementation. And in fact, that everything in the political system will be working against that change. And that, I think, is really kind of important to figure out. So my call would be for the EU is, one, to look at the process, but also it needs to stop focusing on symbolic issues like pride. It needs to start looking beyond the pink veil that is being given to them, presented to them to kind of score points, and actually start looking at what has been done for the people on the ground. For me, I'm really surprised how little the EU writes about people. And I know it's a, you know, neoliberal institution that is focused on whatever it's focused on, but not on people. And so I know that it's the kind of where it comes from, but I think if I were asked to give advice to the EU, which I have done on occasions and surprisingly don't take it up, is that they should really look at people and actually redesign the entire enlargement process by listening to activists on the ground. Because the first thing they will tell you is we need a new regime. I study Serbia, have been studying Serbia for a decade or so, or a bit more. And as long as the same political people are at play, there will be no change. There will be no improvement for LGBT people on the ground. Because the people ruling the country are the people who ruled the countries in 1990 when the wars were happening. It's the same people. And I think as long as the EU doesn't start embracing that the enlargement process is de facto political and not just institutional and a kind of technocratic process, it will never achieve the changes it wants to see for having a union of equality. I think that's all I was going to say. The last point perhaps is that I'm really nervous about the geopolitical turn and the emphasizing of enlargement now in this particular moment as a direct result of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, to me is dangerous. Because one thing the history of enlargement has taught us, well, actually most enlargements have been made because of geopolitical concerns. And what we always have seen in any of those decisions, fundamental rights have dropped off the agenda when geopolitical concerns were very high. So I am extremely worried, and I can see why they're doing it, and I can see that it's necessary probably for regional stability and security. As someone who studies LGBT rights, fundamental rights within this space, I think this is the time for us to be much more active and loud of saying yes, but. We can't say no, but we say yes, but, and this and this and this needs to happen at the same time. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Oh, that was down.
Okay. I quickly want to check with Laura whether you wanted to also jump in here or.
No, I don't know. Do you have time? Because
very briefly.
Okay. Yeah, just maybe to underscore again this point regarding, because I mean my main region of interest is Eastern Partnership and South Caucasus specifically. So I think I can very much echo Koen's concerns regarding this geopolitical logics and you know, as Belinda said, of course, now, I mean, unfortunately, with Russian invasion of Ukraine and the whole shift that it has generated, and the extent to which it has opened up opportunities for countries like Ukraine and Moldova, but also possibly Georgia to when they join the EU, there are indeed a lot of, I mean, there is a window of opportunity to push, and for reforms, for pro-LGBT change. But I think, I mean, we have seen, and we have seen in the past that this has worked, and this is really the precondition, is that when governments do aspire to join the EU or to, you know, in a way have their European identity recognized, then they are willing to push for these reforms. But I think, again, we have to be mindful of how these all geopolitical orientations and linking LGBT rights with geopolitics is not stable. And I think, again, the case of Georgia is quite emblematic here, because after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I mean, declaratively speaking, you know, on the rhetoric level, there is this commitment to membership to the EU. But actually, the government has taken a very pragmatic position vis-a-vis Russia. It has drifted towards a more authoritarian style of a government. And we see that even the sort of little tokenistic, maybe even respect for LGBT rights that used to be present, now it's been kind of reversed. And so we have to be careful and always, yeah, indeed be questioning this geopolitical logic, whether Georgia will get the candidate status or not.
Okay, and on that note.